Wheat Ridge, Colorado, for May the 2nd, 2022. Thank you, counselors, for being with us. We are missing a couple of our counselors, but I believe they'll be here in a little while. We're running a little bit late. We will begin our meeting as we do most of our meetings with comments from our public. We're always glad to have the public join us for our deliberations and speak to us and tell us what's on their mind. So members of the public are invited to speak tonight on items that are on the agenda. So we have two items on the agenda. Number one is our affordable housing strategy and action plan. Item number two is our short-term rental lodgers tax. I have one person signed up to speak, and if you would, when I call your name, please come to the podium. If you would please. Okay, it's a different format. When we get to our regular meetings, we take any comment on any item that is not on the agenda. So if you'll come next week and join us to speak, we'd love to have you. And so do we have anyone who has not signed up to speak tonight who would like to speak on any of the agenda items? If you haven't signed up, you're still we'd still love to have you. Come to the podium, and I'll ask our clerk if we have anyone online. If you're online, you can raise your hand, and we're happy to bring you into the meeting and have you speak to us, but I don't see anyone there. So we will close our public's right to speak, and we'll go to agenda item number one. This is our affordable housing strategy and action plan. Mr. Goff, do we have a staff presentation?
We do. I think I'm going to turn it straight over to Jeff, right? Hurt. He's going to introduce our team who is here this evening and give you some background on this project and the grant that the city received to do this. Jeff?
Thank you. I'll be brief and turn it over to our consultants. But again, it's Jeff Hurt with the Community Development Department. So if you recall, we received a grant late last year from the State Department of Local Affairs to do an affordable housing strategy and action plan as part of their affordable housing program. And I think one of the reasons that we were successful in getting the grant is because it really is an opportune time for us to do this work. We have, as everyone knows, an uptick in demand for residential, some large opportunity sites like Lutheran. So I think we were able to articulate a really strong case and get the grant. And so sort of coupled with the fact that we as a city really lack a really good policy foundation in terms of articulating our priorities, what's important to us in terms of housing, what types of housing we would like to promote, what affordable housing even means in Wheat Ridge. These are things we really don't have, and so that's sort of the purpose of this effort, is to do a lot of that foundational work that is really critical for future hard decisions in terms of things like zoning code changes, how we address large sites like Lutheran related to housing, things of that nature. So we were fortunate to select the firm CZB, who is here tonight, and they are familiar to some of you as they completed the 2019 Neighborhood Revitalization Strategy. So they are really very familiar with Wheat Ridge's sort of unique housing market and our unique conditions and constraints. And so we're excited to be working with them. And I think without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn it over to CZB to kind of walk through the overall project timeline and some goals for the evening and some key questions. And we'll, as staff, kind of sit back and be ready for questions as well. So if you want to take it over, Eric, I'll get the slide teed up here, and I'll give you all hard copies of the presentation as well.
Thanks, Jeff. Can everyone hear this okay? All right, sounds good. Mr. Mayor, Council, thanks for having us back. It's, as Jeff said, we are the firm that worked on not just the 2019 NRS, but also the original in 2004, 2005. So we've had the pleasure of being here to work a few times, and we're really happy to be back again and working with all of you, and happy to be able to contribute to this important project. The agenda for tonight's fairly simple. We heard that a couple of weeks ago you had a 400-page packet, and we did not want to be the reason why anybody suffered eye strain tonight. So we kept it short, kept it simple. We sent one page, just kind of a discussion prompt, we call it. Give you some things to think about, some questions to ponder, and we'll come to those later tonight. But it was just sort of an introductory conversation to get things started. So what our agenda will be tonight is we will introduce our team, go through some of the project basics. We will talk a little bit about a few data points. So it's not a data-less presentation, but it's a data-light presentation as we're just getting underway. But we'll talk a little bit about those to support our conversation, and then we'll go back to those questions and do questions and discussion. Tonight's discussion, as far as we're concerned, is really meant to be generative. So get issues and questions and concerns out on the table. We're just underway, just got our contract earlier this month, just starting to look into data, and we don't have a whole ton done just yet, but it's really a good time for us to get a sense of where council is, what's kind of on your minds, what you're hearing from constituents, what you think you're seeing in the community. And there'll be plenty of time later on to narrow that funnel, but right now, tonight, we're really just trying to provide a chance for you to tell us what you think is going on. And we find that very helpful. Another thing about tonight is it helps us to gauge, the housing topic can be huge. It doesn't have to be huge, but it can be huge and all-encompassing. And if we can get a sense of what's really seems to be areas of greatest interest from council, it helps us to gauge expectations that we can, keep ourselves focused on as we go through the project, as opposed to being too unfocused. This is our team. You may recognize Thomas Eddington to my left from the NRS process, Charles Buki to my right from the NRS process. We are supported by a handful of others. Key to our team for this project will be Karen Beck-Pooley, who's our Director of Research and Analytics. And off to the right on that slide is Jeff Yegian. Jeff is a former colleague of mine from Boulder. He is now an independent housing consultant, and he's got multiple decades of experience in affordable housing work and 20 years on staff in Boulder. And one of the things that we love about bringing Jeff to this team is he's got actual hands-on, roll-up-your-sleeves municipal experience when it comes to a lot of these tools that we're going to be talking about that are going to come into play potentially down the line in a strategy. So, and you'll meet Jeff at a later date. Charles, this is you.
Am I speaking loudly enough? Does this work?
Yes.
It's nice to see you again, Mayor, Council, Rachel, Corey, and to see Patrick. I was looking over some of my notes, and it was a little astonishing to recall that when we did the very first NRS, that's more than 15 years ago. And I did take care to look at those notes. Your incomes were in the low 30s, and the housing values were in the 130s, 140s. So it was a very different market, a very different time. And land values weren't then what they are now. Demand pressures weren't then what they are now. And in fact, a lot of our thinking back then was more organized around the notion of the need for more demand, in fact, and how to think about that. So it really is quite a different world. I think that it's almost impossible to pick up a newspaper in any part of the country and let too many days go by where a housing issue is, if it's not on the front page, it's on the business pages, and if it's in neither of those, it's in a human interest story. And it used to be when I got into the field more than 25 years ago, almost 30 years ago, housing was surely an important topic. It was spoken about frequently, but it seems every 5 years, every 6 years, every 7 years since then, it becomes more front and center an issue. And it's not really receding. It's becoming more complex. It's becoming a steeper and more difficult challenge for communities across the country to cope with. Nobody has cornered the market on getting it all right. We're all working as hard as we can, whether it's at the county level, town level, city level, state level, HFAs, across the country. Everybody is trying to figure this thing out. As a firm, we have worked in more than 40 states, so we've had an opportunity to take a look over these 30 years at a wide array of tools, right? And what we hope in this project is to be able to steal some from, box A, some from box B, some from box C, cut and paste where that's effective, and then create anew where something is missing altogether and you want to, and there's a necessity to invent something here that is responsive to a very local condition. The only other thing I'd add is I want to underscore that it's not just a complex subject, right? Wheat Ridge it's almost complex by a factor, which is to say it's in a complicated region, so it's a complicated subject in a complicated region with a wide nomenclature where any random 15 or 20 folks have differing views on it and sometimes access the subject with a different set of understanding of what terms mean, right? So throughout this project, really figuring out what's going on in this market, what do you want to do here in Wheat Ridge, what can you learn from other communities, how can we stitch this together? I think it'll be an exciting project, and we're delighted to be here.
I want to just do a bit of explanation of the scope. Not a lot of detail here. We understand you've seen the scope of work. There's a lot of detail in there. If you haven't read it in detail, you needn't have, don't worry. But just want to quickly explain what we're going to be up to, what our team is going to be up to in this project. We've got basically 5 pieces of work that will roll up into what's called a strategy and action plan. Each one of these 5 tasks will result in a technical memo, so each one of these 5 steps will be spitting something out as a deliverable, and those will become publicly available as the staff reviews them and accepts them from us. In the first task, we're going to look at a variety of data to make sense of the market, the overall affordability challenge, and specific markets that may be struggling. We will also assess the applicability of tools that could help. Here I'm referencing the House Bill, I think it's 1271, if I have those numbers right, guys, that lists a variety of tools that can be applied for affordable housing benefit. And so we'll kind of be looking at those as part of our charge and figuring out which ones have the most bang for the buck, which ones might not be workable in Wheat Ridge or economically feasible, what have you. That's part of our work. And we'll be looking at locational types and specific locations where those tools might provide affordability benefit and then how those could be applied. So the Lutheran site is an obvious one, but there may be other types of sites like underutilized commercial corridors, things of that nature, and other kinds of sites as well. So we'll be looking at all of that. And eventually that analysis is packaged as strategic options for council to consider later this summer and then fashioned into a final strategy based on your feedback. So that's a lot of stuff to happen. It will happen over time, and we can answer questions that you may have about that later if you'd like. One thing we want to point out at this point is, assuming that there is an agreement on a course of action that we can call the strategy later on this year, there's still a lot of work ahead. So the strategy would be inclusive of various implementation steps, a lot of them representing a lot of work on their own and big decisions on their own, whether it's funding commitments and with budget implications, whether it is potential for zoning changes that would require all that comes with that, as many of you know. So this process that we're working on within this bigger conversation is a really important step, but I think everybody recognizes there will be a lot more work to come after this is done. Quick overview of the timeline. This is doesn't have everything on it, but it's got the stuff that may be of greatest public interest. So we want to make sure we got this on the record tonight. Gives you a sense of what will be happening and when. So we'll be back to council, obviously, as I just said. Expect to reconnect with you at least a few more times late in the summer or early fall, at least. There will be some public events to share information and gather public feedback, so to share with the public the things that we're finding, the research that we're doing, and to get public's feedback and kind of insights and observations about whatever that turns out to be. And in addition to the technical memos that will pop out from each of those 5 tasks, there will be some key deliverable documents that advance the project. So there's a needs assessment component of this, so there'll be a written needs assessment, as well as strategy preview document, and then the final strategy itself with action plan. What's not on here but are still important, and they're sort of in development, is we have a plan to talk with the Race and Equity Task Force at least a couple of times, and Planning Commission as well. And so those dates and logistics are being worked on. So that's sort of the project basics. We have a quick little, what we hope is a quick little section here with a couple of data points to talk about. And again, none of these are the be-all, end-all of analysis. There's going to be a lot more cool data analysis to dive into as the project goes on. These are just sort of some quick hitters based on some very preliminary looks. We call them our early market hunches, and we just wanted to sort of share them with you tonight, and talk through maybe a little bit about the implications that they might have, and see if they prompt any good questions and discussion as we go forward. So some of these might validate some things that you already thought were true, or they might raise some additional questions. We'll see. We'll get into it a little bit and find out what happens. But our first hunch here is that housing costs began to outpace local incomes in Wheat Ridge before COVID. So what you might not be able to read on this slide is we've got a little caveat. So when people go look at this after the meeting, when it's online, they'll see that this is ACS 2025 year data, which we don't need to get into all that right now, but basically know that this is pre-COVID data. And so as we look at data that goes through 2020 into 2021 and 2022, whether it's rent data or sales data, that we'll have updates to this and be able to say more. But for right now, this is what we're looking at. But essentially on this slide, what you can see is on the left-hand side, and for those of you who can't make all that out, I apologize, but you do have handouts, I think, right? So what we see here is on the left-hand side of this chart is a description of an illustration of incomes that are required for buying. That dark blue line is the median owner income in Wheat Ridge over these years, which means half the homeowners have incomes that are higher, half the homeowners have incomes that are lower. But this is the homeowner that's sitting right in the middle. And what we would normally expect is that the median home value would sort of track with that. So in a market that's balanced and working the way it's supposed to, the incomes and the home values would track with each other in some way, shape, or form. And the big takeaway from this side of this slide is that in about 2015, we started to see this divergence. Up until that point, going back in time, there was a rough correlation. The lines crossed at different points, sometimes higher, sometimes lower, but the divergence at that point is pretty clear. And that's where you start to see that the income that you would need to buy the median value home in Wheat Ridge takes off quite dramatically, and owner incomes, while they also went up, did not match that. And so if you have a sense that, wow, houses got really expensive here, even before COVID, then here's a piece of data that might back that up. On the right-hand side, it's a bit more complicated because what we have are the renter incomes. And that dark blue line instead on that side is the median renter household income, where half are above and half are below. And the yellow line is the median rent. And those two are pretty much in alignment for most of this time period. Then there's this little tick from 2019 to 2020 where it starts to come apart. Not necessarily because rents went up so much, but because renter incomes went down. Now, so it's a less dramatic story than it is on the ownership side, but it just sort of shows you for comparison purposes. And again, as we look with other data, more recent data in terms of what's been happening with rents, we'll get a sense of what might be more recent and more relevant on that front. I would say if anybody has questions about, hopefully this stuff isn't super complicated, we didn't mean for it to be. If you have questions as we're going through it, feel free just to.
Can I make a comment?
Absolutely, sure.
So one thing to think about is with all of the many variables that go into thinking about housing, right? So you have to know that you're juggling lots of variables, right? So something as simple as the price of diesel going up can affect the cost of materials. So a 4x8 sheet of plywood can double in cost, and that can add to the materials side of things. At the same time, interest rates can fluctuate as you're now seeing. Labor rates can fluctuate. So all of those things. There's many variables that go into this. But a good rule of thumb, right, is that really as long as interest rates are sitting below about 8%, okay, for mortgage rates. That and income times about 3.5, right, should get you your purchasing power of a house. So if you have $100,000 in income, you should be able to buy a $350,000 house. Right? That doesn't mean you can write a check for the down payment. It doesn't mean you qualify, but just in basic terms, it should work out. So think about it, sometimes it will be a 1 to 3, sometimes a 1 to 3, 3 3/4, 1 to 3 1/3. But if you think 1 to 3.5 is a good starting place to understand a market, right? It's a really good foot in the door. Okay, so when I was here to do the first NRS, your ratio was about 4.3, right? So it was on the north side of that, right? On the housing side, not on the ownership side, not so much on the rental side. Okay, it was already a costly proposition. Okay. Since then, right, your values have gone up 134%, and your incomes have gone up 53%. Right? And so that ratio that should be parked in around 3.5 to make it a balance, hold it in balance, was, when I was here to do the first NRS, already 4+. Now it's 6.5 and pushing fast to get to 7. So 7-to-1 ratio, not a 3.5. So it's twice. It's a 200%, of what it should be. So to validate that big jump up there, right? It's been long in the making, right? And it's got lots of horsepower behind it.
So as Charles was saying, and as we put in the one-page handout that we sent ahead, it's, by almost any measure, it's gotten expensive. It's not really debatable. It is an expensive place to live in a largely expensive market. But something else that we wanted to go to the trouble to point out is the second hunch, which is that there may be a variety of perceptions about how affordable Wheat Ridge is or is not. Because the majority of Wheat Ridge households, despite what we just said, actually have affordable housing costs. And this is especially true for homeowners. Less true for renters, but especially true for homeowners. So what we see on this chart is the breakdown in how many households are paying at least 30% of their income for housing costs. Oh, I'm sorry. There's the chart. So what you see on this chart is that the percentage of households that are paying at least 30% of their annual income for housing costs. 30% of income is the official definition of whether housing is affordable or not. This is the federal definition. It's what we use as a general rule of thumb. We're just going to let this lie for tonight and use 30% as the cutoff. But what you see is that all the way to the right-hand side, all across all the households in the city, renters and owners, 36% are facing those affordability challenges. They're paying more than 30% of their income for housing costs. But if you break that down into renters and owners, which is over to the left, what you see is about half of renters are struggling in that way, whereas less than a quarter of owners are struggling in that way.
So would this graph maybe be, or that last graph maybe be affected by the high volume of long-term ownership that we have in our community?
Yes.
So it could potentially tell, it's telling one story which could potentially not be the actual story.
That's right. So if we go, let's do this. Let's go through this real quick, and then we'll go back a little bit. So here's just one more data point, I think that speaks to what you're saying. But 30% of Wheat Ridge homeowners do not have a mortgage. Okay, that's 25% in the metro region. So it's not like it's, enormously higher, but it is more likely in Wheat Ridge that a homeowner does not have a mortgage. We don't have the data right now in front of us on long-term owners and median age of owners, but yes, that story is very much part of what we're talking about. So if you go back here, if I'm a long-term homeowner, and let's say I've owned my house for 20 years, and maybe I'm going to own it for 20 more years, or I've owned it, whatever, for a long time, I don't really worry about that for myself. In fact, if anything, I'm actually happy about that because that's equity for me. But because I bought my house a long time ago, I don't have to buy this week, then that is not a problem for me. That is a challenge if you're a new buyer. So if you're a new entrant to the Wheat Ridge market and you want to buy a home, that's, a pretty scary looking chart. But the bottom line is that because you've got, again, this is going to be less true of renters because rent is variable. It's very difficult / impossible to lock in the same rent for a very long time, whereas you can lock in a mortgage payment for a very long time. But again, even if we combine them, renters and owners, it's still about 2/3 just don't personally feel this affordability struggle. So it doesn't mean it's not real. It doesn't mean it's not a big deal. It's just worth pointing out, we think, that when it comes to perceptions about affordability, there's just a lot of people who don't spend a lot of time burning a lot of mental energy on this because they don't have to. This is our last one of these, and this is our hunch that what the data tells us preliminarily is that your biggest or one of your biggest issues will be renters at the lower end of the income spectrum. So all you're looking at here is the number of renters in each of these income categories. That's the totality of the gray bar. And then the yellow hatched part of that tells you the percentage that are paying more than 30% of their income. And you can see that those are pretty severe percentages, especially at the lower end, less than $20,000 a year, or $20,000 to roughly $35,000 a year. So when half of all renters are struggling in this way, when you get down to those ranges, you're talking about 80% plus. Charles, do you have anything else you wanted to add to that? Okay.
No, but we would encourage any, curiosities and questions on any of these things.
It may be that these things are completely obvious, and that's totally fine. But if you've got questions or you have a response to that in the short term, feel free to speak up, please.
Thank you. I look at this and it's 30% or more shouldn't be paying for a place. Back in 1969, it was 25%. So it's kind of relative, eh? But also you're totally addressing income. You are not focusing on any debt that people have. And there's a lot of debt out there just because they make so much money. That all comes to play. So it's not just they're all in the black when they go to buy something.
That's a great point, thanks. Yeah, that's all true, that there are a variety of costs that all households have, or many households might have, that are covered in that other 70% of where their money goes, for sure. But that, just as a rule of thumb, for right now, talking about affordability, 30% is a good cutoff.
I do want to acknowledge the point, though. So we will very much look at front ratios and back ratios. So we'll look at a back ratio that will include, mortgage debt as well as short-term obligations, right? And so that 30% number, as Eric had punted for a future discussion, has got it's a whole can of worms we need to discuss in the course of this project. And as you point out, the back ratio, which is the short and long-term debt altogether, right? Really doesn't want to move much north of 40% before household is now cost burden on all debt. So we will definitely look at both ratios.
Because there's issues like school loans,
Absolutely.
car loans,
Right. So
okay, child care. That's a lot of money.
that's right. And so much of that debt, for instance, suppresses the capacity to buy for many young households, right? And when they can't buy, whether it's because of a credit hurdle or a loan-to-value hurdle or an income-to-value hurdle, where do those households who would otherwise buy go? They go into the rental stocks, right? And those rental stocks have to keep pace. And if the rental stock production doesn't keep pace, right, then the supply is constrained, and then you begin to see rents rise. So if you go back 2 slides, you'll begin to see on the far right, the divergence there as well. So we would expect rents to be fairly quickly hitting, $2,000, $2,100, $2,200, $2,300 for very modest units.
I just have some other questions. I've read where more than 17% of homes that are purchased are by investors. And that could be groups of 30 people together or whatever. So that's not helping the housing market at all. And what I see the difference between what is going on now and what has gone on in the past. And like even back where, you know, the people who've lived here for a long time and purchased their houses and stuff, what we have going on now is greed. So how to handle that? Everybody's out to make a buck, okay? And even here in the city, I don't see developers really that are building affordable housing. They go, it's market rate.
So we are seeing that as well. So whether it's REITs or a collection of 24 dentists pooling their resources to pick off a few houses here and there, inventory is extraordinarily tight, and a major cause is the absentee corporate purchaser, without question.
Thank you. I have Councilor Councilor Ohm and then Councilor Hulteen.
Thank you, Mayor. The one question I have is, that number was 30% of all households, there's no mortgages for Wheat Ridge, correct? Was 30%?
30% of homeowners.
Yeah, do not have a mortgage?
Correct.
Have you guys looked at, of that 30%, how many of those owners have a, and I don't know what the word is, like a reduced property tax rate?
Senior exemption.
Yeah, a senior exemption. I don't know if you have that answer. And the reason I'm thinking that is, if you start looking at that, if you find out that there's quite a few, maybe those people will be interested in shifting, you know, either where they live or just, you know what I'm saying, downsizing. Yeah. Thank you.
Sure, that's not data that we've had access to yet or looked at yet. Not because maybe it's not, I don't know if it's available or not, but not because it's not available, but just because we haven't gotten that far in the project yet. But that's an interesting question.
Thank you. Councilor Hulteen.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yay, data. So a couple, I guess one sort of a comment / question. I really appreciate kind of this better understanding of this moment in time as it relates specifically to our community. I mean, a lot of us walked in this room tonight with a lot of sort of anecdotal evidence that we're getting either from news or from, you know, standing on our corner talking to our neighbors, or late night, you know, Zillow stalking, or whatever our source of information is. So this is really helpful to kind of better understand. Looking at sort of the menu of strategies that certainly the grant has, you know, put forward for consideration, and I think a lot of us know are effective ways to start to address housing affordability. As we go through this, like, I guess I find, like, one of my clarifying criteria walking in the room tonight is we're in this moment of time, but the things we're doing have an arc that are going to reach out, you know, like we heard tonight, the original NRS 15 years ago. When you come to Wheat Ridge, you see the implications of that, like, in our community. So as we go through this, how are we going to be looking at, like, what are strategies that are addressing, like, today's housing attainability, and then what are the strategies that, as these market indicators shift, because we all know the housing market will hopefully change at some point, you know, how are we also looking at strategies that are supporting different market conditions? Because, you know, affordability, you know, looks different in different conditions. So is that something that we'll be, you know, looking at also as we have these conversations about what works for Wheat Ridge?
Yes, and there are. Thank you for your small question, Rachel.
Next
Appreciate
question,
it.
please.
Yes, there are certainly acute challenges, and some of this data that we're talking about right now it didn't cease to be true. It probably in some ways got worse in the last couple of years since, you know, this data was fresh, and there are tools in that toolbox. I don't remember at this moment what those 15 different things were that were in the House bill and attached to the grant, but some of those will be better targeted at, you know, the acute things, or things that aren't on that list of 15 that might be other tools under considerations potentially. But there the requirement really to look into the future and think about, okay, where is this place going? Where is this market going? What will those challenges be? What are, understanding that we can't tell the future, what are some of those tools that will best equip us to have some affordability support as we go forward? So there may be things like inclusionary policies help with that, because we don't know how many units might be in the pipeline 5 or 7 or 10 years from now. But if we take some percentage of them, then we know we'll always have those as we go forward. Land dedications or land buys or other forms of acquiring and setting aside land for that purpose is another one of those things, so that no matter what happens, at least we have not forced ourselves to pay future land prices to build affordable housing. And there are a number of other examples as well. I'm sure if you guys want to jump in, feel free. But things like that are really oriented not toward solving today's problem as it stands right now, but rather are oriented toward the future, so that we're carving out the space that we think is important.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. I want to go to Councilor Nosler-Beck online, and then Councilor Dozman.
Thanks, Mayor, and thanks for the presentation. I'm sorry I did come in a little late, but and I think this was kind of answered in the answer that was given to Councilor Hulteen's question, but I've discussed with other members on council and to Councilor Hutchinson's point that I think there's a real opportunity for us to find ways to meet developers in a sense, in a place where we can make sure that we're offering some type of incentive to really encourage affordable housing in our community, because the housing stock right now and the plans that are being presented to us are just completely unattainable for I think most people on those charts that you were just sharing. And so just really looking forward to seeing and keeping our eye on being creative. And I'm hopeful that we're going to take this work and get really creative and innovative on how we can start to make this a part of what is part of Wheat Ridge's fabric in building out some attainable and affordable housing. Thanks.
Thank you. Councilor Dozman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I also have a couple of questions, and one of them is kind of piggybacking on Councilmember Hulteen and Councilmember Nosler-Beck's topic. At what rate are we going to be considering ADUs and short-term rentals? As you may know, we have addressed or are currently addressing bringing accessory dwelling units and short-term rentals into regulations. At what point will that kind of be considered in a factor of offering more housing or affordability for either those long-term owners or people that come into the community and want to invest because of those policies?
Can we clarify, just so we understand what you're asking? Are you talking about the possibility of owners using ADUs or short-term rentals in order to generate income to offset their housing costs?
Yeah, or are also increasing the housing stock as well, for whether that be renters or those that are struggling with affordability.
Okay. So for instance, the ADUs would be a potential way to increase the number of housing units available in the city. Okay. Yes, I think that's one of the tools that's on the list to look at. I don't know. Do you want to say more a bit about how short-term rentals fit in?
Basically supplementing income.
Okay, okay. Charles, do you have anything you want to contribute to that?
It's a tool that I think you would have, you should expect to be covered and to be part of your palette when you have a draft strategy to look at. I wouldn't expect more than that particular tool can deliver. As when you look at the toolkit, right? Whether it's the list that's in the grant or that is proven elsewhere or emerging elsewhere, it's sort of lower. It's higher in publicity and lower in actual delivery, right? So I would say you should consider it, you should expect it, you probably are going to want to give serious consideration to adopting something that has that as a component, but don't expect a great deal from it.
So on that, we have had some workforce housing be brought forth by developers recently. So we had the Fruitvale project, and currently the Howard Johnson is being redeveloped into workforce housing. How much of the market is attracting or is already bringing to fruition developers that realize that this is an expectation or bringing it, to a reality as opposed to us requiring it?
I'd be surprised if any decent developer didn't have a pretty good grasp of land costs and development costs in this region, and would be pretty green to not expect to have to negotiate with the local jurisdiction. The better the developer they are, right, the less they're going to offer, right, and the more they're going to require you as a jurisdiction, right, to do more than your share rather than ask them to do their share. So you're going to, as a jurisdiction, find yourself negotiating with developers, and you're going to want to have as much of an arsenal as you can, sometimes on the carrot side, sometimes on the stick side, to be able to get the kind of numbers you may want to get.
I think we might just add that in the absence of either some kind of requirement and or a subsidy, because a simple requirement may not get it done. It may be a good way for a project not to happen because it makes the numbers not work. But very few developers, in the absence of a requirement, maybe no developers, a requirement and or subsidy will be able to deliver.
No one will. No private
anything at
sector developer is
affordable rate.
no private sector developer is going to produce a below market rate unit. It's a giveaway. Just will not happen, which means you have to require it or you have to incent it.
But it has happened in our community. I mean, we have two developers that we didn't, unless you can correct me and say that we subsidized it in some way.
Fruitdale, you mentioned, is one of them.
Well, yeah.
We subsidize that heavily. And, we spoke earlier, we met this afternoon with these folks and talked about the Howard Johnson a little bit. And, they're not deed restricting that property as affordable. I don't know if they're calling it, I don't know if maybe I made this up, but it's more naturally affordable because of the unit. It's a rehab motel room, right? And they're going to be very small, 1 studios, 1 bedrooms, and 2 bedrooms, and they're just going to be lower rent. They're not going to be deed restricted to a certain AMI.
But they are renting them at a pretty decent price below market rate.
Market rate affordable is what they call them. Yeah.
So then, is the Fruitdale development maybe a kind of formula that we could look to as what may have worked in this community and kind of build on that, or uh-oh.
No.
Reaction from that.
It was, I'm not sure if it's the best formula because it was very complicated. There was a lot of levels in that stack that we had to put together. But, we were preserving a historic property too, so it was different. And it is a historic property, and it required certain development standards and had to meet things. And so I don't think that's probably a good model, but there's plenty of models out there that these guys will bring to us, I believe. Yeah.
Hard to resist an opportunity to talk about Fruitdale, right? It was such a crazy project. I see Lauren smiling back there. 36 pro formas that we went through to get to that deal. So, the stack of money on that is so complex and unique to that project. But you think of, I think we had, $2.1 million in city loans, some short-term, some long-term, a $670,000 home grant, about the same amount in a long-term loan from the Housing Authority, long-term as in 40 years. What else? We had about $2 million in historic preservation tax credits at the state and federal solar tax credits as well. So it was an incredibly complex deal, and all to deliver 5 affordable units and 11 market rate. So, and you know, I think our motivation was it was a cool project for a lot of other reasons, right?
Councilor Hoppy.
Thank you. Well, and I'd like to the point of Fruitel, 5 out of 11 is actually a pretty decent percentage for that particular project. So, you know, so in our packet, it really, the request for feedback was, you know, what does the term affordable mean to us? And who are we concerned that cannot afford to live in Wheat Ridge? And what do we want to learn or get out of this project? And to answer those questions, I would say that affordable means that people who work within our community can live within our community. So that's our teachers, that's our service providers, that's our people in the grocery store. That's all the people that we cried, oh, they're essential, they have to go to work during COVID. Like, those folks should be able to live in our community at a price they can afford. And how do we get there? I mean, I've been on council for 6 years. We've had 2 other study sessions around affordable housing. A lot of the tools that they brought in those toolboxes weren't necessarily things we could do in our municipality due to size, due to the fact that as a municipality, we don't really own a lot of land that's undeveloped land, you know, so that kind of stuff. So I'm really hoping to see what tools we can put in our toolbox specifically to our community. I know there are a lot out there. Out of the presentations we've already had, I felt like that there was very, very little that we could utilize in our community. And so I'm really looking forward to see, you know, what we can come up with. And then I feel like another tool that we need to have in our toolbox is some sort of communication strategy to our community around affordable housing, because we sat through an hour and 15 minutes of residents who, during public comment, were concerned that we were going to build something with those Section 8 holders, those people, and those people that are, you know, have housing Section 8 and they're drug users and they're lazy and they don't have jobs. Like, so there needs to be some sort of communication tool so that we can communicate to our community, like, what does workforce housing actually mean? What does affordable housing, what do we mean when we say attainable housing in our community? And I think that's an important tool that needs to be in the toolbox, along with how do we get that built. So thank you very much for your work on this, and I look forward to where we will be in August and September.
Councilor Hulteen.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So a couple things. So I also want to stay focused on answering the questions that you guys have put forth. I do want to say one thing that's important to me, and I think it's been brought up a couple times tonight, is, you know, a lot of times I think about affordability from an attaining housing. And for me, it's also really important here for a retaining. So it's both attainability and retainability of our housing. I think one of the values that's really deep in our community is being able to stay in our community if it's a place you want to continue living. So, so what does housing retention look like from strategies? And, you know, and it could be like what Ms. Dozman brought up around, you know, could you look at, you know, short-term rentals or ADUs to create additional income in your house or your home? So for me, affordable is very similar to what Ms. Hoppy said. You know, it's the people who enjoy Wheat Ridge or work, live, play here, learn here, can choose to live here. And it's also intergenerational opportunities. So we've talked about it a lot on this council about how, you know, what people want for housing is going to look different at different points in their lives. So that that ability to find housing here is going to, you know, be something different. When I was 26, I did not want to live on a half acre. And believe me, when I'm 60, I do not want to also still have my half acre. So looking at sort of that diversification of options so that we're meeting people at different points in their lives. So that's important. One of the things I learned in the NRS from Eric, the data deep diver, is he pulled forward a statistic that I have used quite a bit, which is roughly fewer than half of our population has lived here longer than 10 years. And that was in 2019 that data point came forward. So I'm just really aware that, things that even recently we thought we couldn't do as a community, our community is changing pretty rapidly. So keeping in mind, things that we thought we couldn't do before, we very well could do in the near future, if not soon. Other considerations for me, I'm most concerned, honestly, sometimes I get concerned seniors can't stay in Wheat Ridge. Seniors are most at risk of becoming homeless demographically, and they have fixed incomes and increasing costs all around them. So intergenerational strategies are important to me. And a couple of other things that stand out. One of the strategies that was provided in the House Bill 1271, how do we look at our commercial properties as opportunities that we can leverage? I think we've got a really interesting stock of commercial buildings in our city that it'd be fun to take a fresh look at from a lot of different vantage points. Transportation and location efficient land use is important to me. So how are we really looking at opportunities for people to not have to own a car, because owning a car is another significant budgetary consideration for people. So we've got transit, which we're developing quickly. We've got great transit corridors. And then I think the last thing that is in my list here is just really thinking about goals of, is housing, are the goals for stability, openness of community, wealth building? And I don't really have the answers to that, but I think when we're looking at owning versus renting, sometimes those different goals come into play. So I just kind of want to put them on the table. And I just want to say, I couldn't afford my house today. I couldn't afford my house 5 years ago. Luckily, I'm now in that minority of people who've lived here 10 years. I haven't been able to afford my house for over half the time I've lived in the city. And I'm really aware of the privilege I have to live in my house. And I'm really aware it's hard for me to get neighbors. So I'm excited that we're doing this, and I know you guys will do a great job of bringing forward strategies for us.
Thank you. Councilor Weaver.
Thank you. I'm not going to try and address all of those questions because I think they've been well said by several of the members here, but I very much appreciated the fact that you all have separated the ownership and renter. I'm concerned about, because they're very different ways, and I think oftentimes on council it's easy to focus just on ownership for lots of reasons, and I'd really like to understand the best, sort of what are the best practices in a rental field, because we do have quite, even before the most recent rental projects that have been built in Wheat Ridge, we have quite a few renters, and they are silent. And we all know that these are often silent constituents for lots of reasons. So I'd really like to understand the strategies for both sides so that it doesn't keep sort of growing. I feel like the gap between ownership and rental just continues to grow in stigma as well. So how are ways that we can bring that together and have those voices heard, if that makes sense? So thank you, and thanks for this. I appreciate you breaking it down the way you have tonight.
Councilor Stites.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I won't restate what Ms. Hoppy and Ms. Hulteen said, because I think that they brought up very good questions, very good points. And specifically, I want to address what Ms. Hoppy said about the communication strategy. And I think working with you guys on the NRS, you were able to really help us put together a really good communication strategy for getting into the public and getting people behind what we're doing. Because unfortunately, none of this is going to matter if we select a site and then all the neighbors throw a fit and pass a petition and get it stopped before it even happens. So really getting some sort of a communication strategy to our citizens, that they understand what affordable housing is, and that we're not trying to bring in the drug addicts, and we're really trying to house the teachers, the police officers, people who are public servants who don't make $150,000, $200,000 a year. We're talking about people who make a normal income, $50,000, $60,000 a year, and are trying to support a family. So all great points. I just want to make sure that we really do focus on getting into the community so that we understand and that our citizens understand that what this is and why we're trying to do it. Thank you.
Councilor Ohm.
Thank you, Mayor. I agree that I'd like to see at a minimum affordable housing proportional to the people who work here. So whatever that number, if we could equate how many people actually work here, and then do we have that affordable housing, where do they fit on the salary range? And then I'd like to see diversity of the users, so single people, family, seniors, diversity. And then the second diversity is the type of housing and the footprint size relative to the user. So if it was a single person, it would be a much smaller home, could be a single, detached. And then also diversity on projects of having market rate mixed in with affordable housing. And I know sometimes that's really hard for developers, where I know what happens a lot is that the municipality can mandate, this is what needs to happen, and then in the end, the developer opts to maybe pay a fee, and then they pass that fee onto the end user, and then what happens is the real estate market gets even more expensive. And so I don't know how we craft that language. I know you said the carrot and the stick but how can we make that happen more often where we do create some type of affordable housing? Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Dozeman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So thank you for bringing up those points, Councilmember Ohm, and I would agree with many of the points that my colleagues have made in regards to what affordable means and who we're most concerned about not being able to afford, and some of the tools and information that we'd like to gain out of this project. So I am literally every statistic in this. I'm a lifelong resident of Wheat Ridge. However, I am renting my childhood home from my parents, a home in which I have wanted to purchase in the last 5 years, which it is completely out of my range to buy that home. And as morbid as it is, the best case scenario for me coming into ownership of that home is my parents either allowing me to take over the deed or them passing away and giving it to me. And for me, it's a huge concern to not have young families be able to afford to live in Wheat Ridge. And also that we have a very large senior population who are on fixed incomes, and them no longer being able to afford living in Wheat Ridge. We've all been aware of schools being on the chopping block anytime we're discussing school closures, because our community is not having that generational turnover and attracting young families. So the diversity of housing and the diversity of homeowners or renters, since we have a large population that rents in this community, is extremely important. And right after I actually got elected to City Council, I attended the Smart Growth Conference in San Francisco, and my debate partner from high school happened to be living there at the time. She's the same age. Her name is actually the same. It's Leah. We were Leah squared, so that was fun. But her and I were able to meet for dinner, and we got to talking about the demographics in San Francisco. And she lived on the outskirts of San Francisco in a pretty seedy neighborhood, because she said, they had been implementing all of these what they hoped to be affordable housing policies, which really required below market rate housing. And so you were either extremely wealthy and could afford to live in San Francisco, or you were completely subsidized and living in San Francisco. And so that entire middle income demographic was completely missing from San Francisco, and that is what I do not want to see happen, because I fall within that middle range, and many of us in this room fall within that middle range. And so as we're talking about those that can't afford the middle class is disappearing right before our eyes. And so that is a big concern of mine as well. You know, we would like for our community to continue to be affordable, but at what cost? Thank you.
Thank you. Charles?
If there's one thing that I think I'd like to leave you with tonight is you begin to think about what's going to tie these tools together. 6 tools, 12 tools, 20 tools, in what way? How do they get knitted together? What's the thread that binds these things together, okay? It's going to be land. At the end of the day, it's going to be land. It's going to be a square foot of earth, okay? That's going to be at $30 a square foot, $40 a square foot, and $50 a square foot until you're at $2, $3, $4 million an acre, okay? And that you're going to have to look to policies and look to a regulating framework that places land in the context, right, of the realities of development finance, right? And in the larger context, which is that you happen to be in a very desirable region that is very good at creating high-paying jobs, and until that external reality, right, ceases to be a defining characteristic, right, land is going to be the name of the game, right? So I suspect we'll come back to land over and over and over again, right? Who owns it, how it's traded, how it's regulated, how it relates to density, how it relates to height, how that relates to total development costs. So I would just encourage everybody, be really thinking about how do we think about land in the city.
Okay. Have we, you had 3 questions here. Have we answered your questions adequately to get you all
With bells on.
kicked on and kicked out of here? Okay. So
Thank you for having us.
thank you very much for coming. Appreciate it. And thank you for a great discussion. And I think I speak for the council and probably our residents that we really look forward to seeing the data come back and your reports.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. Appreciate it. Poor children. That's my children. That's my children in the basement.
Sorry.
Okay. Okay, with that, we will go to agenda item number 2. This is a discussion on our short-term rental lodgers tax. And we welcome our city attorney, Mr. Dahl, and our director, Allison Scheck. And nice to have you join us. So, Mr. Goff, please kick this one off.
Thank you, Mayor. So back in March of this year, Mayor Pro Tem Holteen and Councilmember Hoppe requested an item for a future study session to look at our lodgers tax, and specifically the short-term rental portion of the lodgers tax and its rate and its use, and maybe potentially looking at dedicating or committing the revenues coming from the short-term rental portion of the lodgers tax to some specific uses. So I would like to turn it over first to Council members Hoppe and Holteen, and then once they describe their intent of this, we can, staff has put together with Mr. Dahl and Ali Scheck, we've done some research, put together a little bit of history about our lodgers tax and short-term rental tax, did a little comparison of tax rates across the metro area, came up with some options if City Council would like to actually go to a ballot with a question to our voters, which I believe was the intent of our 2 council members. So Rachel or Janice?
Great, thank you, Patrick. I think I've had a chance to talk to most of you, but this came about when we were setting the short-term rental regulation. we heard both in this room and then from others not willing to come forward because they were running illegal short-term rentals at the time, that our lodger's tax was really high and was creating a barrier for them to be, successful. And one of the things that came out of setting the regulatory environment for short-term rentals was, we realized that it's an opportunity to bring people into our community, and I think we have a good regulatory environment that doesn't have too many short-term rentals. We have good regulations around, being good neighbors, and, we've got the 2-night minimum. So there's a lot of things that I think have been working, and we haven't been hearing a lot of complaints or major issues. And in fact, I think we don't even have all of the licenses spoken for at this point. So the program seems to be rolling out. So, I found myself thinking about, this lodger's tax at 10% is set at that rate because of the disproportionate number of, police activity or police calls to the hotels and motels that we've historically had. And at this point, we have a licensing program that's hopefully going to reduce those, but the short-term rental properties really aren't contributing to that need for that additional funds that come out of that tax. So I had an interest last summer and had heard from several people to look at reducing the short-term rental tax rate to be less than the 10% that we charge for the lodger's tax. As I've been thinking about that and been really looking at the lodger's taxes in place because the hotels, motels create a problem that creates revenue demand on our city. So it's a problem that's funding its solution. And as we talked about tonight, the short-term rentals both, help retain some people in their homes, but can contribute to housing scarcity. And so what I would like for us to consider is to reduce the short-term rental tax rate to find a rate that seems reasonable when we're looking at that as far as, what's being paid across the metropolitan area, and to actually set that aside to create a fund that could be used specifically for housing affordability. I think as many of you know, the Fruitdale project that was just referenced pretty much wiped out our housing authority funding that we have. And so currently the city doesn't have dedicated housing affordability funds available to it. So that's my big picture thinking, and I think what got us here tonight. Councilwoman Hoppe, do you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, along those lines too, and we're doing the work and we've moved forward to start doing our housing strategy, an action plan, and a piece of that probably should have something like a housing authority involved in it, whether they have the money to do what we did with Fruitdale or not, but even just for guidance. And, we heard from several of the short-term rentals that our tax was significantly higher compared to other municipalities. And in the memo, it shows us there's only 10% of the 28 communities that are in this memo that are 10% or above. And so that would definitely put us in the minority that would put us in the slim high. So this would be something where we could, it goes hand in hand with, like Councilwoman Hulteen was saying, short-term rentals, while can help some people stay in their places, it can also create some housing scarcity. I think we did address that quite a bit by making sure that we didn't have corporations like Expedia owning homes and having STRs in our community. But this really does go hand in hand with, working towards housing attainability, and whether that is education for homeowners or help with down payments. Like, there's a lot of different things that we could do with this money that doesn't necessarily need to go into, and also in the interim, we have also gotten our hotel motel licensing program pulled together, right? So that should minimize some of the police action that we need in that area. So it really kind of makes sense that this short-term rental housing piece goes with housing attainability.
Thank you. Any discussion on this item? Councilor Weaver.
And I may have missed some of the discussion on this, but why does it need to go to a ballot?
Sorry. I'm sorry,
Yeah,
I may have, I thought we might have been,
Yeah, if it's
Okay.
okay with you, Mr. Mayor, if I
Sure,
could
go ahead.
do a little bit more background.
Okay.
It might help with some of the questions. As I mentioned earlier, we put together a memo with some of the history on our lodger's tax and short-term rental, and again, what the rates are in the metro area, and put together some potential ballot language or options for you. And some of those options include a ballot language. But, so in 1986, City Council, or the City of Wheat Ridge, initiated its first lodging tax at 5%. And that 5% went into the general fund from that point on to be used for any general fund services. In 1988, November, there was an election to increase that by 5%.
98.
That's what I said, 1998, didn't I?
Oh, I thought I heard 88, but I could be wrong.
Oh, I'm sorry, I could have. 1998, thanks for the correction,
Sure.
Mr. Dahl. Stay there, I might screw up some more. 1998, which was effective January 1st of 1999, and it was increased by 5%, and that 5% was to be split between for crime prevention activities and infrastructure improvements. And the intent was that it was supposed to be used, as Councilmember Holteen mentioned, to deal with the impacts in the hotel motel district. But we do have a legal opinion that the ballot language does not restrict it only to those areas. That the monies can be used anywhere in the city, really. But for the most part, we've been dedicating those revenues to the I-70 Kipling area. And today, the money, the 20% goes into the CIP budget, because that's where the public infrastructure is funded, and then the 30% goes into, we have a crime prevention fund, and that funds, Ally, do you remember, 3 officers, crime prevention officers? It changes every year, I think.
Yeah, I think it's 5 or 6 now.
Basically
Yeah.
funds our crime prevention program out of the police departments. So, then in February 2021, council passed a short-term rental ordinance, and the reason we stuck with the 10%, and Dahl can speak more about Tabor, but we have a taxpayer's bill of rights, and you got to be very careful about any tax initiative or question, because it could trigger Tabor requirements, Tabor elections and such, and Tabor notices. So we decided at the time to keep the short-term rental tax at 10%, because if we created a standalone tax for short-term rental, it probably would have been a Tabor question. So we would have had gone to the vote of the people to ask for that. But we didn't. We kept it at 10%. It's the same as a current tax that the city has on the books, a lodger's tax. So it was not a Tabor question. We did not have to go to the vote of the people.
And I'll just add that it was pretty clear in the definition of lodgers services or lodging services that STRs were included.
Yeah.
In that definition. That, I mean, we double checked that. We added the verbiage STR to the code.
Yep.
But it was very clear to us that, you know, in this whole time, STRs, had they been licensing, had they had the ability to, would have been paying the lodger's tax.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Great point. Court.
So I know for hotels, that's pretty prescribed, but where that money goes. But is that also the same for the short-term rental?
It is, and yeah, if you look in the financial impact section of your memo, it shows where money goes, and the short-term rental portion of that is combined with the rest. So the 50, as I mentioned, 50% of the 10% goes into the general fund, and it's kind of interesting. You can see the big dip in 2020 during COVID, but we saw 756,000 in 2019. We're estimating about 750 this year. Crime prevention and then the capital. So in 2019, total lodger's tax, including short-term rental, is about 1.5. Of course, we didn't have short-term rental at that point, did we? And then in 2022, we're estimating about 1.5. Of that, we estimated about 240,000. We're estimating we're going to get in short-term rental lodging tax a year, 240,000, and that's split again amongst those 3 different funds. A little bit. So as again, Councilmember Holteen mentioned, there's a chart in here that does show what the rates are across the metro area. just keep in mind, there's a little note here that some of these cities, this is from Colorado Municipal League, they did a research for us on this. Some of these cities don't have an active short-term rental program. An example is the city of Lakewood. I just sent them our ordinance, actually. They're looking at it. But they do, I believe, as you see on here, they show that if they do have a short-term rental, I think they still require them to pay the tax, but they don't actively have a program on the books, or they don't actively regulate it. So they charge 3% of sales tax and then 3% lodger's tax on top of it. In Wheat Ridge, we do a flat 10%. That's in lieu of sales tax. So we don't charge sales tax on top of that. And Councilmember Olteen's right, we are one of the highest. Denver is higher, 10.75. Golden just increased theirs last year to 9%.
Yeah, last November,
Yeah.
they added a 6%, I think, specific STR tax.
Yep.
And it speaks to your point, Mr. Goff, about how more and more agencies, staff today actually heard from Westminster asking for a copy of our ordinance.
Oh, okay.
And as they, and so as they take, this will change
Yeah.
as cities hone in on this as a particular topic.
So Councilmember Holteen mentioned a desire to potentially decrease the tax rate for short-term rentals, the portion that is charged as short-term rentals of our lodger's tax. We estimate that for every 1% decrease, so if you went from 10% to 9%, it's about a $24,000 decrease in lodger's tax revenue to the city. So, do you want to do the options, or you want me to start them? You want to talk about Tabor?
Yeah, really.
I'll start with the options, and then we'll let you jump in.
Fair enough.
So we have several options.
Yeah, more than three,
we
which
have
is
more than three,
really
yeah.
disappointing to me.
It was hard for Jerry to get over that.
really
Jerry and
hard
I
for
said
me.
in the lobby, there are actually 6.
Yeah. So the first option, of course, is kind of status quo, just continuing what we're doing, keep the tax rate at 10%. And council could, through the budget process or just administratively, you could decide to restrict those revenues generated from short-term rentals to attainable housing, affordable housing, homelessness, whatever you'd like to do. No ordinance or election is required in that scenario. So that's option one. Option two, if you want to reduce the short-term rental portion of the lodger's tax by ordinance, council could do that, which we'd be amending section 22 of the code. In this instance, the short-term rental tax is still subject to the split, 50% general fund, 30% to crime prevention, and 20% to capital improvement. So council could do that by ordinance. The third option is to adopt an ordinance, but it only becomes effective upon approval of a referred measure. So you put it on the ballot and ask the voters if they want to decrease the tax level and dedicate it to, again, affordable housing and or homeless initiatives or whatever you decide. That's option 3. Option 4 is don't pass an ordinance, city council, but just put a question on the ballot asking voters to, again, approve a reduction in this STR portion of the lodger's tax and, again, dedicate 100% of the STR revenues to whatever you want to dedicate it to. And we did put a couple ballot question examples in there, and as I mentioned before, and Dalton talked about this maybe a little bit more, but you could do a Tabor election if you'd like also, and create a standalone short-term rental tax, but that would trigger a Tabor election, so it's a little more complicated. The ballot question has to be very specific. The first sentence has to say, shall taxes be increased by a certain amount, and we're not increasing taxes, so it's a little complicated, and you have to do a Tabor notice. So we really recommend if you want to put something on the ballot, you keep the question very specific as we've suggested here, so it doesn't trigger a Tabor election. So if you want to go to the ballot, we have to have, that's done by ordinance, and we have to have the final question to the city or to the county by the 1st of September. So that means August 22nd would be the last date of city council could approve this by public hearing. Election costs, they are doing There wouldn't be a cost for the city this election, November, because it's not a city council election. We're not planning to have any other questions on the ballot, at least at this point. So there would be no cost unless we do put a question on. We got an estimate of about $20,000 for a question on the ballot. And it's increased quite a bit, about 40% over normal, because they're going to start doing bilingual ballots this year. So we have about $14,000 budgeted in this year's budget for any election expense, but we just found out it's going to be a little bit higher this year. So maybe turn it over to Ally and Dalton if I missed anything.
You know, to help you kind of navigate through the options a little bit, in thinking about this and getting ready for this evening, it occurred to me that there's a couple of different public policy themes here, and the different options do or don't advance them. And if I were a council member, I'd be starting with the public policy themes and thinking about what I wanted to make happen or not happen. And as I go through the alternatives, really, option one, the public policy that it advances is housing and homelessness, because you're keeping the revenue the revenue stream the same, and you're allocating a portion of it to housing and homeless purposes. So that's you're sort of shifting funds to support that public policy purpose. When you go down to number two, you're reducing the revenue stream. So now you're doing at least one thing, and possibly two. You are supporting the STR community, and that's directly, that responds directly to the concerns that Councilmember Hulteen, has seen and wanted to address. But if you're reducing the STR portion of the lodger's tax, then you're doing that support. You could add to that, but it's not in option number two, the first public policy, fund homelessness, but just reducing the STR portion, doesn't advance the first public policy choice. The others do both. Number three appears to do both, or you could make it the way the language is written. It does. It supports STRs by reducing their tax, or the tax burden they have, and it supports homelessness. You're doing that with less revenue, though, as I think you can appreciate. You're doing that with, however much you reduce the lodger's tax by, that's now the revenue stream is less, and you're supporting homeless efforts with whatever portion of that reduced revenue stream. And maybe you say, we'll reduce the revenue stream by, whatever the percent is. Let's invent the number, $200,000, whatever that translates to in percentage. And that number gets devoted to homeless and housing, but you're going to have to pay for that number out of the reduced revenue stream, which is fine. Those are public policy choices council makes all the time. The two different approaches to the ballot are adopt an ordinance first until ask the voters, shall this ordinance become effective? But you've already written it so they can kind of see it. Door number two is, do you authorize us to do the following things, and we'll do it by ordinance if the ballot question passes, and that's more of a political consideration for you. But I wanted to sort of think maybe about what the public policies that you're wanting to support and how these options match up with those policies. So, questions?
We had a couple of questions. Councilor Hoppe.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And first, I need to apologize, but I have to leave at 8:15, so I'm going to lay down all my comments on you folks. And then I'm going to split and pass it like a hot potato, so I'm really sorry about that. But, so, during the Let's Talk, housing, a concern about housing affordability in our community rose to the top of the conversations in almost every single one of the Let's Talks that have happened so far. When we were doing the Lutheran Legacy Campus, it rose to the top of the conversation. In the last two citizen surveys, identified as important. So this is definitely, housing attainability in our community is definitely important to our community. They are saying it in several different spaces. If you look at where we're at with our lodgers tax, I'd said only 10% of the municipality, of the information we were given in this table, only 10% of them are 10% tax or higher. 25% of them are 8% or higher. And I would be more comfortable with us being in more of an 8%. And so for me personally, I think 8% is a good number to hit on. With that, that would mean that we lose $24,000 less in lodgers tax per percentage that we lower. So currently, as it is at the 10%, it could potentially projected be $240,000 for the year. So minus our 24,000 per percentage point, that would be 48,000 less, which would be $192,000 estimated revenue that we could put towards this, towards housing attainability. I think it's important that our housing authority is reinvigorated and introduced into working in our community. They currently only have one meeting a year, and I personally prefer our fourth option, the referred measure, asking for the voter approval, because in the difference between this one and the third one, as I understand it, is that we will say that it's dedicated 100% to affordable housing, rather than say we're going to use some of this for affordable housing. So that's kind of how I read the differences in those two. The election costs, so we do have $14,000 already in the budget. There's a $6,000 gap. I think that we could probably cover that $6,000 without even coming close to scratching our prudent reserve. And I think that it would be, important to cover that through our general fund. So that's where I'm at. Those are my comments.
Thank you. Councilor Dozeman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I haven't really had any constituents reach out and have this be too burdensome. Have staff or other council members had feedback from STR owners that it is too burdensome and maybe preventing them or future STRs from coming about?
I haven't personally, but I don't, Ally and her department deals with the licensing, and they talk to probably all of the license holders, so.
One pretty vocal STR property owner, and I think maybe initially we might have heard from a couple, but nothing, I would say one.
I would say that I've had 3 specific ones reach out to me in the beginning that they were very upset about how high it was, and they were hoping that we wouldn't go that high. Once it was a done deal, they're like, this is really unfortunate, but they weren't like, calling me every week. I'm like, it's done. Don't call me every week. So.
Thank you. Councilor Ohm.
Thank you, Mayor. I have one question. The first question is, or maybe it's 2 questions. How is the SDR structured in regards to the service calls akin to like the hotels? And where I'm going with this is I want to have a little bit of a basis of, so we had the lodgers tax, and I understand that was to do with the hotels. What's the real cost to the police department for short-term rentals? Do we have an idea of like where we're at? Because it sounds like what we're doing is we're saying, we were dedicating that 240, and some of that split went to the police department, and now we're saying none of it's going to go to the police department. And I just want to know if we had any idea what that was.
Others may have a better answer than me, but that's a really good question. I think a couple of things. First, I recall the 1998 ballot measure. I helped to write it, and you're right. The impetus, as Mr. Goff described, was really that the police calls in that area. I don't think I'd be surprised if we had police department data on responses to STRs, and Ally's got something to tell you about that. But I would also say that the split will continue. You know, the 3/5, 2/5 will remain unless there's a ballot question that adjusts it. So even if you have a lower revenue stream in total, half of that, half of that is still going to get split, the 2/5, 3/5, because that was the ballot question in 1998, and the voters approved that. Now, if you're going to the voters, you can articulate kind of how the split should be adjusted to make it all work. But that split is there unless you have an electoral, action on it. But what about the PD and STRs?
I don't know, I was actually just looking to see if Chief was on.
Yeah, I'm just texting him to see if
Yeah.
he's got a quick answer.
Yeah.
Honestly, I haven't heard anything about short-term rentals causing too much of a problem.
Not since we implemented the ordinance. I mean, part of the
Yeah.
reason for bringing it forward, actually, what was that, right? There were so many calls coming into the non-emergency number and the emergency number about activity. And so I think we'll have to go do some data gathering unless the chief gets back to Mr. Goff. But
It's nothing compared
Yes.
to what we'd see at our hotels.
well, and since we put the ordinance into play, and well, really the licensing program into play with our vendor, with Lodging Revs, there's a complaint function for neighbors to use. They don't do all the compliance and the complaint follow-up, but there is a way for neighbors through the app to actually, through a link on our website, to report some complaints that then make their way to staff. So I think the ordinance alone has reduced the impact on PD, because I know, I haven't been hearing about it.
The chief just responded. He says, we don't specifically track, but just a general conversation I had a couple weeks ago found that we don't really see that many PD calls.
Councilor Hulteen.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So a couple things, just Leah, you asked about if we've heard from people, and when we were setting the regulatory environment, we actually heard here in the room from a couple people on it. And I have two constituents, and then one who's actually in District 1 who continues to talk to me about it on occasion. And one of them's, Chris McCune at Roost Farms. So there are, those out there. I think a lot of them don't even know that this is an advocacy avenue to talk about it, in part because it's a relatively new program that we put together through licensing. And I think the conversation's been good. Councilmember Weaver asked about, why would we go to the ballot? And I think going to the ballot's important for a couple of reasons. One is, for relating to our first conversation tonight around attainable housing, we are having citywide conversations about this, and we have an amazing program through What's Up Wheat Ridge and through our Let's Talk, and we're engaging a lot of people. But taking things to the ballot is a way of really engaging our community in a conversation, and it's never great, right? It's always really messy. But I think it's also a form of communication to let people know that we're taking action around housing affordability. And it's not a huge pot of money, and we're not going to be able to have a huge impact with it, but it can be catalytic to get other things in motion, like our housing authority, to be having discussions on how it can be best used. It can support, our housing navigator and our new one that's coming on board. So I think there's a lot of things that can come out of it. And I think taking it to the ballots are a great way of engaging our community and some awareness around it. So that's why, for me, when this came together, I put the two together because they are related to me. And it's not just me wanting to reduce the short-term. I have heard from operators that they're hearing that it's more expensive than our neighbors. So.
Councilor Stites.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Ally probably is the right person to ask. How are we doing on the licenses? Are we, I think Rachel mentioned that we're not at capacity yet, but how close are we?
I'm sorry, I don't have that data with me. We're not at any of the caps, but I can report that tomorrow, just, the numbers per district.
Okay, thank you. I was just kind of wondering because, as we see that pot grow essentially, and this is all money that we didn't have a year ago. So this is essentially, it's not going right now, we're not counting on this to fund the PD or anything like that. So I would definitely support this going that direction. So if I'm understanding, this doesn't necessarily have to go to a ballot. If we can reduce it on our own, but we can't change the spread of where we go with it. It has to go to the same pots essentially. But we
That's
can
correct.
add a pot without going, so we can add an affordable housing pot to that?
You could add an affordable housing pot, but it would have to come out of the first 5%.
That currently goes in
is-
the general fund.
That goes into general fund, because that's basically unallocated, and so you could direct that part of that be used for whatever purpose.
Got it, okay.
Yeah.
I'm a little worried about this going to the ballot, just because I know it will help the short-term rental owners, but I think all of those neighbors that were upset about having them in the neighborhood in the first place may, might have something to say about us wanting to reduce it, and maybe they don't know about the caps and all that stuff, so they may think that we're trying to generate more short-term rentals, whereas we've already got that capped. We're just trying to reallocate the funds. So I would support it going to the ballot, but we definitely need to have a clear message as to why we're trying to do that, I guess would be my.
Counselor Hutchinson.
Thank you, Mayor. It's cold in here, but anyway.
That's what Ally said.
My feeling about it is it's not broken, don't fix it. When we've got other cities who are looking at what we have done and they are interested in what's going on, we aren't having problems with short-term rentals now because we do have licensing and we do have people are knowing about it and things like that. Is there any interest about homeless going into short-term rentals? Are you looking at that or something? Okay, because I'm also wondering about the vendor who is keeping track of licensing. How much do we pay for them? Does that come out of general fund?
Yes, it does, Counselor Hudson. We pay for it out of the general fund. I want to say it's about $14,000 a year. It's something like that.
Yeah. So short-term rentals, like the noise ordinance, has been talked about for years and years. And finally, we have something that's in place. And we're not having the problems. The deal about crime prevention fund, to me, is important. We have crime that is going up all the time. Things can happen anywhere, anytime. And if this is working right now, so why do we want to go back and change this? Affordable housing, we don't even know what we're talking about. We don't have a strategy. We don't have plans. That's changing every single day. So this is working, and I think I'm for leaving it as it is. I haven't heard from many people complaining about things that are going on. There's, rules and stuff, and just leave it instead of keep going back and changing things, Why didn't we do this then when we voted on this before? So I think leave it as it is. Thanks.
Counselor Dozeman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So one of my questions was what is the proposed reduction? Does anybody have an idea of a number, or are we 8%, somewhere around there?
It's really it's up for discussion,
okay.
but my preference would be that we wouldn't go lower than 8%.
I would definitely agree with that, and I would agree with some of the concerns that Councilmember Stites voiced. We worked really hard to pass this legislation, and it was many years in the making, and I would be concerned at referring this to the ballot and having residents activate and us having to revisit this in a larger picture in some form or another. And I personally wouldn't mind seeing it be reduced to 8% and going directly to homeless or affordable housing. However, I would have to agree that because we don't currently have a plan in place for affordable housing, whether that would be able to go to the homeless or housing navigator, that's to be unsaid, but I have, I think, more concerns about the backlash of referring this at this juncture than I have with maintaining it and either maintaining the 10% and having it be allocated towards affordable housing and homelessness strategies, or just leaving it as is.
Thank you. Counselor Hulteen?
I'll go ahead and let Ms. Hoppy go first since she has to leave.
Counselor
If
Hoppy?
that's okay with you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councilwoman Hulteen. I guess for the tax doesn't really open the door to, do we change how many STRs you can have? Do we change the distance of where you're notifying people? And yeah, you know, that was, STR was a heavy lift, and we did a good one. The reason why the tax is the way it is because that's what we had, rather than taking the whole thing to a ballot. So that's what we had, and a tool that we could use. So this is a look back on a piece that that wasn't necessarily negotiable, right? So that makes this piece negotiable if we want to do it this way. So, and then as far as the affordable housing stuff, I mean, we do have a lot of funds that we have now dedicated to our homeless navigator. We have a housing navigator coming, and I think that what we should start looking at is, how, and while we're doing this study, I think that it would be important for a group like the Housing Authority to be involved in that study and having those conversations and guiding that study a little more. And so that's why I think it'd be important for us to reactivate the Housing Authority and for this money to go to them towards attainability. And there's lots of different ways and also tools that they're going to come to us with a toolbox for us to look at, that the Housing Authority, if they have this money for housing attainability, and the only way that we can 100% dedicate that is through option number 4. It's like walking and chewing gum at the same time. Instead of going step 1, step 2, step 3, we can do some things congruently, and I think that's important.
Counselor Hulteen?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So one thing that, just is good to keep in mind, if this were to move forward to a referred ballot measure, and actually, so if we refer it and the voters approve it, it wouldn't go into effect. I mean, we wouldn't see these funds starting to accrue until next year. And what I find myself thinking about is we will be adopting our housing affordability plan in the fall. And this would actually create a fund for us to be able to take quick action. And right now, we don't have any dedicated funding in our budget that allows us to take significant quick action in terms of housing. But we'll have a lot of policy options, but as far as programmatic options that allow us to either work with our own housing navigator, our own housing authority, or partner with Community First Foundation to do they've got some pretty innovative things they're doing. So to me, this is an opportunity to create some revenue for us to be able to take some short-term actions around helping people with housing in our community. So we don't have a fund right now, and this is to me seem like an elegant option to create that fund. None of it's still even going to happen that quickly, and so that was my thinking on that. And I agree with Ms. Hoppy. I wouldn't want to go below 8%. It is reducing revenue that is currently budgeted in the city. So I mean, I'm not looking. I wouldn't support anything less than 8% because we still want it to be generating revenue.
And the licensing fees, this is not about the licensing fees, this is about the taxes. So the licensing fees are still going towards the management program and that kind of stuff.
Thank you. My turn. I have some questions. I'm not sure who would go to answer this, but we, in the sales tax portion of our chart here, we're talking about city sales tax. Do we pay a state sales tax on these lodgings?
No, this is a lot, no. We don't, ours is in lieu of sales tax, so it's 10% lodger's tax only.
Okay, so we're not obligated, or the merchant who is leasing out these rental rooms are not obligated to pay
No,
State
no,
tax or
it's-
RTD
no,
tax or?
it's not taxed by those agencies.
Okay. Okay. I agree that I think that we're generating a revenue stream that would be good to dedicate to homelessness issues. I don't think we're cost burdened or tax burdening our STRs with a 10% tax, particularly if we were to make it 8%. I think, I don't know what a room runs for, an STR runs for, must be $100 a night or more than $100 a night. So is $2 or $4 if it's 200, a price differential there where it affects, the ability of a Wheat Ridge STR owner operator to not be able to get a unit because it's a few percentage points less in Arvada or in Edgewater and 0.75% more in Denver. Do they accrue a great value? I think I disagree with my colleague, Councilor Hulteen, that I'm not sure going to the ballot generates a great deal of public response or public positive response to questions that are reasonably complex. I agree with Ms. Dozeman and Councilor Hutchison that we've sort of made policy on this and not that long ago, and that maybe that policy should have a chance to take effect. So I have Councilor Dozeman in the queue next.
I have a couple questions. So in regards to the conversation surrounding allocating those funds to the housing authority and reactivating them in some form or another, would that be a true mechanism of this if we were to allocate, whether it's 8 or 10% towards homelessness and affordability? Would that go to the housing authority, or how would that process work?
Well, maybe that's more direction we need tonight, also on exactly where, for what uses, you'd want these monies dedicated. I think we've been using, in the memo, we threw in attainable housing, affordable housing, homelessness, so I think we need some direction on exactly what that is. If it's homelessness issues, I don't think the housing authority, it would go to them. We have a housing navigation program that I think that it'd be helping fund that. If you want to do some affordable housing, attainable housing programs and services, I think we could activate the housing authority. It's not a lot of money to do much construction or building of affordable housing, but you could do some programming maybe for down payment assistance and different things like that, potentially. I would not recommend that you dedicate it to a specific entity if you put it in a ballot question. I think that hamstrings us too much. We don't know what's going to happen in the next couple of years. I think that would be more of an administrative decision. If council wants to use the housing authority as an avenue, we could do that, but I would not put that in the question.
So just to wrap up my thoughts on this, I do believe, I can't say that I would disagree with decreasing the taxes burden on our taxpayers, but at the same time, I agree with Mayor Starker in the respect that 8 to 10% isn't that different for the STR owner, but it is a significant revenue loss for us as a government entity. And currently, we could do number one, a budgetary and administrative process and create that 10% lodgers tax on STRs to go to homelessness issues without having to refer it to the ballot, incurring those additional costs for putting it on a ballot initiative, and potentially having a backlash from the community when we've just buttoned up this policy. So as of right now, I think if the goal here is to have these funds allocated for homelessness issues or affordability, then we can currently do that with the 10% lodgers tax that is already being incurred by the STRs. And I would hate to see us have to revisit this policy for just a handful of people that this is currently directly affecting. And I think just from my point of view, as of right now, I am leaning towards one or none.
Counselor Weaver.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I really like the idea of allocating towards housing. I think my question is more for Ally and Patrick of I see up in the mountain areas that 10% is pretty standard. And so my only concern is if we lower it to 8%, which I would think would be nice, but I guess my question is do you all think that in the next few years, as people put in ordinances, that we're going to see, right, they're going to sort of set the standard at 10%. Denver set the standard at 10%. A lot of the Summit Grand have 10%. Right, would it just, are we doing something temporary and then we're sort of risking in 2 years coming back and saying, you know, everybody's at 10% now?
Yeah, and this data in your memo doesn't include any mountain towns. We specifically didn't because they're
and
almost, I mean, they're higher in 10, they're 14, 15,
Sure.
20%, but that's
I guess
different.
my point is
Yeah.
that
I think
with the
that's a
housing
good
market-
possibility that it's,
Okay.
other cities, I mean, Golden just did it. It could happen, yeah. Other cities might start bumping up and, you know, depends what Lakewood decides to do. I don't know if they'll go, right now they're at 3 and 3, so.
Yeah.
But again, they don't have an official code for short-term rentals, so not sure what they'll decide.
I guess my concern is it's a lot of effort now if it ends up that we want it at 10% in 2 years. And I think, for me, the more important thing is allocating that money towards, because I completely agree with you, Councilor Hulteen, that having that pot of money ready is exactly what we're going for. So those are my thoughts. Thanks.
Counselor Ohm.
Thank you, Mayor. One question I had is, do we know on short-term rentals, like, are these people hitting, 70% occupancy, 80%, probably not 100? So that we could, and I don't know how we'd find that data, but just so that we could kind of gauge, because one of my constituents made a statement that, we're not Denver. Denver has a lot of amenities, so therefore Denver should be able to charge that interest rate, or that fee of the whatever 10.75. But we don't have enough things in Wheat Ridge, they can, shops and stuff like that. That was the
You're closer to the mountains.
Yeah. But what's interesting is that Golden is now charging 9%. I would feel, and so I've only had one constituent that complained about it. Maybe 8% isn't the number, maybe it's 9%, and then it's exactly like Golden. And I do have concerns that, yes, in a few years, what are other surrounding municipalities, what are they going to charge? And I would hate to, even if I'm not around at some point, like, hey, we need to go to the ballot because we need to raise taxes. And so it's tough to gauge where we're going to be on that. But if we had an idea of if these people are renting out and they're 100%, there's a lot less justification for decreasing, that rate. So that's my comment. But I do think it'd be nice to have something earmarked for affordable housing. But I am wary that, putting it on the ballot, I'm not sure how constituents will respond to it. They might be supportive if they see something that's earmarked for homelessness, which is definitely a huge issue, and affordable housing. They might have questions of why are we reducing this? So, thank you.
Counselor Stites, and then Counselor Dozman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, I think I definitely agree with Ms. Weaver and Mr. Ohm. I don't know that I would support right now reducing this, because I do think that it's responding to only a few constituents when I think that we can help a lot more keeping it as it is. But I do support somehow creating the other bucket that it goes into affordable housing, because as we get these strategies, if we're sitting there going, okay, now we need to figure out a way to fund any of it, and we don't have any money in reserve for it, then there's no point in having the strategies. It would be nice to have them, but we can't do it. So I would support us definitely moving forward with some sort of ordinance change right now, or whatever that we need to do to create that third bucket and start putting money from the 10% into that, so that we don't have to go to the ballot and we don't have to change anything. Thank you.
Councilor Dozeman?
Thank you. I just wanted to add to that, you know, if we're maintaining a 10% lodgers tax on STRs and we're dedicating it to housing and homelessness purposes, then we're making a bigger impact on that and saving us money by not going to a ballot initiative. And I think that, like I said, number one is probably the best case scenario right now.
Councilor Hulteen?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I am hearing, so I'm going to ask for a consensus in a minute, but the thing that we haven't really discussed is what to use it for. So it seems to me like that's a next study session.
Yeah, it could be. We could bring back a draft ordinance with some ideas, unless you want to try to flush that out now. Amana's saying no.
Yeah, I think, yeah, let's do it, because we don't really have a memo with like what some of those options are and what that looks like. So I'd rather have a little preparation around, and especially if we're not going to the ballot, then we don't have that quite the same time urgency around that. So, so with that, I would like to ask for a consensus to support option number 1 in our packet, which allows us to retain the current lodgers tax, but designate the short-term rental-generated tax revenues for housing and homeless purposes. Do I have a consensus for that?
We have consensus around number 1. Thank you.
Val raised her hand as well.
I saw that.
Oh, and asking staff to come back. We'll do a future study session on what those funds could be used for, or how to do that. Thank you.
You said housing, I'm sorry, housing and homeless?
I just read it like it's written in here,
Okay.
for housing and homeless purposes.
Okay.
So that's something that we would handle through the budget process?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. All right, thank you very much. That concludes discussion on item number 2. And we can go to staff reports. Mr. Goff.
I don't have anything this evening, Mr. Mayor.
Okay. We will go to elected officials' reports.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry?
Can I defer my time to Ms. Alishek?
Well, no, this is sort of offline. I think there's a fee involved with
I
that.
defer the rest of my time.
I want you to say
Mr.
that
President,
again.
I defer the rest of my time.
Okay.
Has anyone ever heard the city clerk laugh quite like that? Yeah. I just
Director
wanted to,
Scheck.
thank you so much, Mayor. I just wanted to point out a little item that's in your Mayor's Matters that just came out today, and that is that Sarah Spalding, I just wanted to bring this up because she is so public, and you all know her very well, has announced her resignation and will be leaving us on May 20th. Sarah is headed to Grand Junction to be the Director of Communications for the City of Grand Junction. And she and her husband are super excited about the move. Bruce sees nothing but mountain biking in his future. So I just wanted to make sure you knew that for perhaps when you run into her next. Thank you.
Yeah. Close to the Grand Mesa. Great. All right, thank you.
And wine, Mayor, and lots of wine. And peaches. But mostly
Yes,
wine.
Mostly wine. Maybe a little peach wine along the way. All right, we'll go with elected officials' reports, and I'll turn around and see if my city clerk has anything that he wants to offer tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Nothing new this evening.
Okay, thank you so much. I can see most hands are raised. I'll go and see if Ms. Nosler-Beck, I don't see a hand yet there. Well, she's got one hand raised, but I don't see the yellow one. Go ahead.
Thanks, Mayor, so much. First, I just wanted to apologize for being tardy. Just had a sick kiddo trying to figure out schedules this evening. So just appreciate the flexibility that our hybrid model has afforded this so that I could be a part of the conversation tonight. Thank you to everybody, and also to Mayor Pro Tem Hulteen for helping me kind of navigate what I was going to do today. So thank you. And then also, it's really weird because I can see myself talking back on the screen, and I'm trying to not do that while I'm talking. But the other thing that I just wanted to make sure everyone is doing this week is giving a special thank you to all of our teachers and educators for Teacher Appreciation Week. Our teachers really have kept our community together over the past 2 years specifically, but just thank a teacher if you get a chance. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Additional elected officials, Councilor Hutchinson.
Thank you, Mayor. I second it on the Teacher Appreciation Week. Say thank you to all the teachers that your kids have and things.
Absolutely.
And then I have a question. What is the truck driving around, that's poly truck with all the wires that they're doing, hanging wires and stuff?
Like electrical wires, or have you noticed?
Yeah, like up on, going into people's backyards. And
Polly
things like
is the name of the truck you see?
Pauley.
I don't know. It could be a contractor for Excel doing work. I see if there's a permit in the
Because a
city.
couple weeks ago on 35th, off of Otis Street, I got a hold of the city because there was a wire that was it was like 4 feet off the sidewalk, just kind of drooping down. And they're going through the neighborhoods, and then they're just, I don't know what they're doing. But they're putting up this black kind of a wire, and they don't ever say anything. Of course,
Yeah, I
they're
don't
not
know.
in my
I'll
backyard.
check around, see if we know anything about it. I'll let you know.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Additional elected officials matters, Councilor Owen.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to tell everybody I had a really good experience. Last Wednesday, I volunteered for doing some trail maintenance for Jeffco with my daughter and her friend, because they're on the National Honor Society, and so they're trying to fulfill hours. So if anybody has any other ideas for hours, I just want to personally thank Kurt, Lori, and Josh. It was a really good experience. It wasn't, I was using a pick and stuff and a shovel, but it was good to get out there and help. And we got a lot of people thanked us on the trail as they walked by, and so it was a good experience for everybody. And if anybody has any other ideas for volunteer hours with the city, please let me know. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Dozeman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just have 2 quick events. So our Economic Development Director, Steve Art, and our City Manager, Patrick Goff, are presenting the State of the City to the Wheat Ridge Chamber this Thursday, May 5th, from 11:30 to 12:30. Tickets and registration are available at the Wheat Ridge Chamber of Commerce. And then Saturday, May 7th and May 8th, through May 8th, is the Spring Honeybee Festival at All Seasons Holiday Market. So they have a lot of local honey from farms throughout Colorado, and it's sure to be a good time. So go check it out.
Thank you. Councilor Hulteen.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just would like to remind everybody that this Wednesday from 4:30 to 6:30 at the Active Adult Center is the West 35th Avenue Improvements Open House. This is looking at how to make it safer for people walking and riding their bike along that corridor. So please, everybody, stop by, give your thoughts, encourage your neighbors to do so. I use that corridor frequently, and am looking forward to showing up and sharing my thoughts. So hope to see you guys there.
Thank you. And that leads me into a segue that they also have a survey out on 35th Avenue to what to do with the bike thing that I believe is open until the May 11th. So I think everyone hopefully will take a chance to take that survey. I started to take it, but they wanted some comments, so I needed to think about what I wanted to write. So couldn't do that on my phone. I have a schedule conflict and wanted to let everyone know that I will not be having coffee with the mayor on May 14th, but we'll be back in June. And I wanted to just make sure that everybody knew that next Sunday was Mother's Day, and please take care of your mothers. So, if there's no more business, one more thing.
I'm sorry, the police department is going to be at our Wheat Ridge Recreation Center. I believe it's this Wednesday from 9 to 11. So I think it's coffee with a cop. You can stop by and say hi, or if you have questions, please stop by. They'll be out in front of the rec center. And so please stop by. Thanks.
Maybe we'll need Moscow mules with the mayor, I don't know. Moscow, Idaho, I'm sure, is where they come from. So anyway, if there's no more business to come before the council, we will stand adjourned. Thank you all.